Okay, if you could kindly take a seat. Okay, it's always a challenge to get people back from coffee, and especially if there's chocolate cake there as well. I recognize that. Okay, so we're now on the penultimate session. First of all, a very brief introduction. I'm Danny Kalman. I'm a trustee of the AJR, and I head up the special interest group of the Kindertransport at the AJR, and I'm also chair of the Next Generation Committee at the AJR. And it's wearing that hat of the next generations. And Anita very eloquently asked the question earlier on about the role of the next generations. And I think that leads on very nicely in terms of the relevance and the importance of testimony and the role of the next generations as sadly the first generation are passing away. So this is such a key topic. I know that in this room, as has been mentioned before, most of us are second generation, and I know we have some third generation. Do we have any fourth generation in the room? Okay, no. Okay, so we'll stick to second and third generation. We got a brilliant panel. I'm going to very briefly introduce them because most of their details are in the bios that you have a copy of or can get a copy of. The first speaker will be Hephzibah Rudofsky, who's been working in Holocaust education for 20 years and daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And in 2009, she set up her own educational program, Surviving the Holocaust. More from Hephzibah shortly. Then Dr. Noemi Lopian is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Sitting next to Hephzibah, Dr. Ernest Israel Bornstein and Rennie Bornstein. Noemi actually lived in Germany until the age of 13 before moving to Manchester. Next to Noemi is Hannah. I'm not going to indicate who is second generation and who is third generation on the panel, but I'll leave that to your imagination. Hannah is the chair of the Yom HaShoah Manchester Committee. She may look a bit bleary-eyed because I think she organised an event a couple of nights ago with 1,000 people in Manchester, and she's also a member of the leadership team for the Northern Holocaust Education Group. And she's absolutely committed to providing quality Holocaust education. And finally, Anita Peleg is the chair of trustees for G2G, Generation to Generation, and is currently applying her 20 years of research and teaching experience to educate about the Holocaust. So I'm going to kick off and ask Hephzibah to kick us off. Thanks, Hephzibah.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank AJR for inviting me to speak here today. It's a great privilege, and it's been a fantastic conference. Sorry, it's gone back. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust camp survivors and refugees. My mother and her parents were incarcerated in Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, and Biberach. My father escaped to Britain from Holland in May 1940 on the SS Bodegraven. I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of people who hoarded and cherished things. So unsurprisingly, I too am a collector, a documenter and organizer. Growing up, I was eager to learn more about the wartime experiences of my mother, Lady Zahava Khan. But, like many second-generation children, I didn't want to probe old wounds. The right time came in 2001, after the death of my grandmother, when my mother found a bag she had kept from Bergen-Belsen in the back of a cupboard in my grandmother's room. It contained a trove of unique artifacts and photos from the camps. My mother had no idea this collection existed. And then the next few slides, these are just some of the artifacts that were found at the back of the cupboard. As you can see, these are extraordinary historical artifacts. As time passed, I felt compelled to do something with these artifacts and pass on the story behind them, to uncover what had happened to my family during the war. But my interest in the Holocaust and in survivor stories had predated this discovery. At first, I had been engrossed in someone else's story. In 2006, I was the school's tour director of a play based on survivor testimony, which I took to hundreds of schools and prisons. That powerful experience showed me the true impact of a direct encounter with the words and live presence of a survivor. It inspired me to see how my mother's story could matter beyond our family and a way it could be told. But I was aware that my shy, reserved, modest mother wasn't a natural communicator. I was also aware that I was. Together in 2009, we set up the Surviving the Holocaust project. We visited hundreds of schools across Britain and in Germany, sharing with tens of thousands of pupils from all backgrounds what Hephzibah and her family had gone through in Nazi Europe and showing them the artifacts. With me by her side, Hephzibah opened up in a way she would never have considered possible on her own. Our project was and is very successful. This success was due in part to the direct access young people were given to a survivor standing in front of them, telling her story, and in part to the tangible objects we were showing them. This direct connection with history gave our presentation a visceral impact impossible to recreate in a textbook account. For many young people, almost completely ignorant of the Holocaust, we were the first point of contact for their education in this uniquely tragic event. This was a tremendous responsibility. I forensically listed every detail of our talk and the events themselves. I recorded everything, year group, numbers of pupils present, and collected student responses to see what had impacted them most and what they would like to see and hear more about, and what less. But I was also disturbed, especially at first, by the feeling that in stepping in to help my mother tell her story, I was somehow trying to take center stage. After all, it hadn't happened to me, at least not directly. Because, of course, growing up with the survivor of a parent has a big impact. Yet it wasn't I who had been incarcerated in concentration camps, and the story we were telling was her story, not my own second-generation story. It was as I were taking ownership of someone else's story, denying Hephzibah a voice of her own. Over the years, I came to see that, in fact, what I was wrestling with was a microcosm of what everyone in this room, esteemed professionals among you, is wrestling with. How best to use first-hand survivor testimony as an educational tool in the future. And more recently, how to transition a Holocaust education project over the loss of that survivor. Sadly, my mother passed away last summer. When I first started supporting my mother to tell her story in schools, I felt very strongly that it shouldn't only be the experience of survivors with powerful, natural communication skills that are passed on. Every story is unique and precious, but without my input and involvement, I don't think my mother could have shared her story in this way or in the depth of detail. That's why I felt it was my mission to team up with her in passing on that story to as many young people as possible. We're told we must never forget. There wasn't one Holocaust, but 6 million. Every single survivor testimony is of immense value, especially in an age of Holocaust distortion and denial. Stalin infamously said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic." That's why individual stories, individual tragedies are so important. We must not let the sheer scale of the catastrophe desensitize our audiences. And the most powerful way of all to communicate this history, I believed, was the way we were doing it. Live presentations where the survivor, in this case my mother, speaks directly to the audience. We were also very lucky to have such a wealth of unique artifacts which have so enriched the telling of my mother's story and brought her history to life. People are always awestruck when they see the real things. But as my mother got older, she became frailer and her memory began to decline. This made me realize that our project would have to evolve. I've always resisted virtual Holocaust testimony because I have seen myself the immense impact of having a survivor live in front of you. Digital representations have always, for me, felt second best. But Zahava was invited to record her testimony for various archives, including AJR Refugee Voices, and she was glad to do so. I became aware that such testimony could be incorporated into our presentations and used in the future. I was already anticipating that someday, when Zahava was no longer with us, this could prove an invaluable way of preserving the memory of her live appearances and presentations. Then came COVID, a watershed for our project. It hit at a moment when I could already see that Zahava's declining memory meant that talks were becoming too much for her. For the first year, I adapted the talks online. It was challenging not to have the live interaction. What matters for me is making a direct connection with the people I'm talking to, which I think virtual talks can't provide. When COVID restrictions lifted, I realized I would have to change the format of the live talk completely and deliver it on my own. This meant incorporating recordings of Zahava as well as continue to show her artifacts. I also adapted the talks to make them more interactive with my audiences. Can I just have a tiny sip of water? Sorry. But I had to do more than that, because I knew that young audiences connect most with direct personal experience. I realized that I would have to make myself part of the story, which I had never done before. Instead now of simply acting as editor and shaper of my mother's story, I would have to risk exposing my own vulnerability by also telling my second-generation story. I have dug deeply into my mother's past, and not a day goes by without my thinking of some aspect of the war. How would I have coped with the hunger, the cold, the fear, disease? It is very different to tell your own story, and I'm still getting used to it. But I began to understand that this was how to continue telling my mother's story when she no longer could. Her presence is very much felt, as is her absence. Even as I tell my story, I know that our stories are inextricably intertwined. After Zahava's death, the talk changed again. I realized that to a greater extent, I could now tell the story I wanted to tell. I was free, in a way I hadn't been when she was alive, to add details that might have been painful for her, to research her story more, to make connections with other stories, to place what happened to Zahava in a wider context, even to go beyond the Holocaust, to shine a light on universal themes of resilience and overcoming adversity, which connect so powerfully with young audiences. And most of all, to draw a lesson that remains sadly as important today as ever, the lesson that we must fight the evils of racism and persecution which still blight our world. These were impulses I'd shied away from when she was alive, wary of taking too much ownership of what was her story. I'm lucky to be the custodian of her extraordinary artifacts, which will outlive me and continue to tell the story of my family when all of us are no longer here. I dare say I will have to embrace digital platforms despite my reservations, because one of the deepest insights of my experience has been that the way we communicate the history is always changing, and as custodians, it is our duty to adapt. Paper and photographs fade over time, but there are many exciting possibilities for new technologies to preserve and even develop the stories and testimonies of survivors and their children. I look forward to embracing the challenges and opportunities offered by these technologies. I realize I've had an amazing and privileged opportunity to develop and expand the talk without betraying the original story in any way, but giving it extra depth and context to make it more meaningful for students in terms of historical knowledge and understanding. What I want above all is for my mother's story and experience not to be forgotten. I feel a duty to pass on her story, not only because it's her story, but because it's part of a bigger story, and one that is more vital today with the passing of survivors, the continuing conspiracy theory of Holocaust denial, and the persistence of the evil of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hephzibah, and that's really been a great start to the discussion. We're going to move slightly into a different way of involving the other panelists, and I'm going to ask them 2 or 3 questions, and going to answer in a couple of minutes each, and then I'll pass on to the second question and third question. So, Anita, could I start with you? And the question is, could you briefly tell us a little bit about your own family background, and how did you get involved in sharing your family history?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, my mother, Noemi Blake, was born in Czechoslovakia in 1924. I grew up knowing her story from, I don't know what age. She always talked about what happened to her. It was never a mystery. She was born in Czechoslovakia, which then became Hungary in 1938. And so she was subjected to the anti-Jewish restrictive laws in Hungary, which she often said possibly saved her because she wasn't deported until 1944. But in 1944, she and her family members were deported to Auschwitz. And she told me from a very early age all the details. When I was 9 years old, I remember going away with her to Bournemouth, a holiday just with her. And she decided then that it was okay to tell me everything in detail. And she ordered breakfast in bed. It was a real treat. And after eating, I snuggled up next to her in bed, and she told me, blow by blow, everything. And I wasn't traumatized. I wasn't even that upset, and I'm not quite sure why, except that I know that the way she told me her story was almost in a positive way because she survived, or maybe because I saw that she survived and I felt so proud of her. But she was a calm person, despite the fact that she was deported to Auschwitz. She lost a large number of family members when she returned to Mukachevo after the war with her sister. She was reunited with 3 other family members, but she was born into a family of 10 children. And there were also 10 of her nephews and nieces. And so only 7 out of 28 family members survived. I think part of the reason why she was able to tell her story so calmly to me was because after the war she went to Palestine. She became part of the struggle, the war in independence, and it gave her something positive, even though some people might say that's a bit controversial. And then several years later, after meeting my father, who was a refugee from Berlin, who had managed to escape in June of 1939 to London, she decided to make her life in London. And in the need to express herself, she became a sculptor. And she developed some fame, I would say, within Jewish and Christian circles. And what was particularly important for her through her sculpture was to express the importance of promoting understanding between faiths. And it was this positive outlook that she had, her need to express herself subconsciously through her sculpture, and her ability to express her story to me and to my brother, that made me know that I had to tell her story. And even at the age of 9, after she told me her story, she said, one day, I want you to write my story, which I finally did in 2014. But in the lead up to that, I had also given several talks about her sculpture, about her life, and I just knew that eventually I would write the book. Finally, she was 90 years old. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. I wrote her story, We did a big exhibition of her work. And just a few years later, I met 4 very important women. 2 of them are in the audience here, Helen and Leslie, Sharman and Bernice, all involved themselves in Holocaust education. They had already started generation to generation, looking forward to how we're going to deal with telling those stories. And I joined them. And I'm pleased to say that there's an enormous amount of... There are 10 of us here today from generation to generation, and I'll tell you more about that if I get a chance with another question.
Okay. Hannah, over to you.
Much briefer, my story is.
Sorry.
Just because I didn't really grow up knowing my grandpa's story. He was on the Kindertransport. He was born in Germany. He had a brother that came over. I was always told on the same boat, and I found out only 6 months ago they actually came over on separate boats. His brother stayed in London. He came to Manchester, and that was kind of really all I knew. And we just kind of didn't talk about it. He had a few pictures dotted around his house, and I just knew that my dad didn't have grandparents in the same way that my mum had grandparents. And growing up in Manchester, there's lots and lots of survivors, so to be a granddaughter of a survivor was absolutely nothing unique. It was probably more unique to not have a survivor in your family. And we used to go to the Yom HaShoah Memorial in Manchester every year, and I could see the numbers of people attending dwindling, even kind of I started going, funny enough, at the age of 9. Year on year, there were less and less people, and I knew eventually it was something that I wanted to get involved with, and I did, and I actually went back to university. I did a master's in Holocaust studies, and got involved almost kind of by accident, that I just realised that even though that Manchester had this fabulous survivor community, the actual Holocaust education just wasn't happening in Manchester. And at the time, and it is different now, at the time, everything seemed very, very London-centric, and Manchester was just kind of missed off altogether. So I got involved in Yom HaShoah, and it has grown. I'm very pleased to say, and it's not just because of me at all, I don't take credit, it's definitely a team effort, but we've doubled our attendance within kind of 4 or 5 years. And that just shows that the survivors are still really important, but it's also that the second generation and the third generation and maybe the fourth generation also have this voice. And at the Yom HaShoah event this year, unfortunately, we had more second generation speaking than survivors, but their stories were still so powerful because they came over kind of, my mum did this, or, you know, my grandpa did this. And actually, I think that gives it that personal connection. We are never, ever going to take away from the survivors' testimonies, and I'm sure every single person in this room would agree with that we're not taking their place, but we're kind of the next best thing. And I realised that actually my grandpa's story, although I didn't know lots of it, was really important. And so I am fortunate enough to be able to go into schools. G2G have been phenomenally helpful with the Northern Holocaust Education Group, and I just want to continue doing it.
Great. Okay, thank you. And Noemi.
You, like me, are now the last standing, and I thank you still for being in the room with us. I think you're all amazing after nearly 2-day conference. And I see our friends from Usham there, and Usham is celebrating 30 years of existence today, so it's very nice they're here with us. And another incidental is it's Hitler's birthday. Somebody told me today, not that that is a cause of celebration. So, by now you can hear I've got a little twang, and indeed if people ask me where you're from, and I say Manchester, very proudly they say where you're really from. And like Danny said, I grew up in Germany, in Munich, in Bavaria, not knowing a thing about Nazi Germany, unaware. I loved my childhood, particularly Christmas time was magical. My father was a camp survivor. He was in camps over 4.5 years from the age of 19. And the first 2 years when war broke out in 1939 in Poland, he frequently went into hiding. He was liberated by the Americans on the 30th of April, 1945, and he was He went to a DP camp and subsequently studied medicine and dentistry and became the founder of the Association of Persecutees in Munich. And with that foundation, he was the first one to erect a plaque in Dachau. He spoke twice yearly, once at the Rathaus, at the town hall, on Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, and another time too in Dachau. He believed fiercely in Holocaust education and wrote the book, The Long Night, Die Lange Nacht. He wrote it, he gave 4 reasons, but within each of these reasons was for all of us to know. And sitting in the room today and yesterday, I think that each of you, be it academic, be it testimonial, be it art, you're all so innovative, you all do an invaluable, most valuable job, and a job that will be more and more necessary. And I think each of you is equal and amazing, and just keep going and keep doing more. That's my dad, and he met my mum at a bar mitzvah. My mum is French, from Strasbourg, France, and I only found out her story through really a friend asking and digging for a Yom HaShoah ceremony in Manchester, what about your mother? I always knew that my mum had lost relatives. They always talked, my mother and her older sister, we meet for many, many years for afternoon tea, French afternoon tea on a Sunday. And I found out that my mum was a little girl of 10 when she was arrested and questioned at gunpoint by the Gestapo with her older sister Helen, 13, and her younger brother Joé in Annemasse, which is the French-Swiss border of Switzerland. So how did I find out? Can I still say it, Danny? Is it too long?
No, carry on.
No.
Another minute.
Tell me, yeah. How did I find out about the Holocaust? I went to a non-Jewish gymnasium, Sophie Scholl Gymnasium, with 1,800 girls. My sister and I were the only Jewesses in the village. And not being of the Catholic faith, it was obligatory to go to religious education lessons, and I went to ethics lessons. And being nerdy, I quite liked them because they were more risque than your ordinary lessons. But one week we had the Holocaust, and all I remember is 3 pictures. And I always tell the school kids, it's not because I'm an ancient dinosaur, and I clap, that almost happened immediately. Because it was 3 pictures. One of a crater of glasses, one of a crater of hair, and one of a crater of bones. And my friends and I looked at each other. We didn't speak, but the eyes were talking. 2 questions. Did you know? And is it true? I was 13, and I went home to my mother that day and asked, is it true? Hoping it was one of those grim fables by the Brothers Grimm. And indeed it was true. We shelved it, we never spoke about it again. And I only came to the Shoah very, very late, even though I'm a passionate educator, at the age of 36. And I can tell you more later.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi. I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes or each, if that's at all possible, can you tell me a little bit more about the organizations that you're involved in? I know you touched upon it very briefly, Anita and Hannah. And in particular, who are you talking to? Who's your audience? Anita first.
Oh, thank you. So Generation to Generation, we're a Holocaust education charity. We enable 2nd and 3rd generation. We haven't got any 4th generation yet, but they're always welcome, to tell their family stories. Our audiences are anybody who wants to organize a Holocaust education activity. This year in particular, almost 70% were schools. And to be honest, that is really our main target. We really, really want to get into schools. But this year we were in prisons, which was really interesting. We are presenting to private organizations, to lawyers, to accountants, civic organizations, religious organizations. Most of all, I think we'd really like to have some Muslim audiences, but that's a little bit more tricky, and that's for the future. We've grown from strength to strength. There is enormous demand from schools to have a live speaker. They really want people to come in and talk to their kids. This year, this academic year, we have spoken, 27 speakers have spoken to 300 different audiences, and I think we've spoken to more than 40,000 people, which is really quite incredible, and it's really, really hard work. We believe that, and I think you heard me say that before, that the descendants and close friends of survivors have a really important role in Holocaust education. And that's what we really are all about. What's really important is that because we are descendants, we understand that we need to work a little bit harder. We're not the real deal. We therefore train our speakers. We help them every step of the way to develop a really slick, engaging presentation. We involve our wonderful historian, Dr. Jamie Ashworth, to make sure that what we say is historically accurate. And most important is the role of testimony. Because we believe, just as everybody else here, that testimony is the key. And it's like we're the custodians of that testimony. We tell the narrative, but we use that testimony to illustrate, and we get really, really good positive feedback from that interaction between the descendant who knew that survivor and the testimony that they tell. And in some cases, there's some of our speakers who, like, sorry, and I don't remember your name, but Karen, like Karen, have testimony from those that didn't survive, which is even more powerful. They have letters, and that becomes part of their presentations. I think I've probably said enough, but there is demand. We work closely with a lot of other organizations, and we're very happy to be involved in any of the projects that have been mentioned here, and we really, really hope that the role of second and third and fourth generation will become important to everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Anita. Hannah, over to you.
I hope no one minds. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. I completely agree with everything that you've just said. One thing that's not been mentioned is funding and money. And G2G runs with volunteers, but a website costs money. Marketing costs money. NHIG's the same, we're volunteers, but we need training, we need money, travel costs. You know, I'm very fortunate, I work part-time, but Caroline Slivkin, who some of you may have heard before, we've just finished a project together that was funded by the lottery. That's brilliant, the money's run out, we've got to reapply again. I did some wonderful, actually also with Caroline, wonderful, wonderful projects with the Imperial War Museum in the north and Manchester Jewish Museum. The funding ran out. We couldn't carry it on. So there's also something that I really think that we need to look at, maybe not necessarily today, but the testimonies are there, and the people that want to give the testimonies are there, but the funding isn't always there. And at the moment, for me and for kind of my colleagues, that is something that is actually really, really preventing us getting to more people. And I think that's something that we need to kind of investigate, because there are so many groups and a lot of people are doing very, very similar things, and I think it is about pooling resources, and it's about working together, and it's not trying to reinvent the wheel. It's going, like we've done with G2G, you're actually brilliant, what are you doing, can you help us, give us some resources, and then let's carry that on. But the money is a massive, massive stumbling block.
Okay, I'm not sure who in the room that's a plea to, but never mind, it's that very important topic. Noemi, over to you.
And when I started to talk, I challenged myself, or indeed the audience, particularly if not of Jewish faith, why should they care? Why should they care about a bunch of people they might know very little about or have nothing to do with? Why should they care about something that happened so long ago? that is historic, that is relic. How do we empathize, particularly being conscious that we're second generation? Yes, we use testimony, yes, we use stories, but as much as my audience is removed, so am I one removed. Yes, I might have lived it, yes, I bleed and I care, but still, I'm not them. I decided to team up with the grandson of a Nazi, and we go around schools telling our stories raw. The reason I say that somebody thought we're going to preach about reconciliation and enlightenment. I'd like to think I don't preach, because my kids will pull me up, but I'm a bit of an activator, and I try and make people think about prejudice, othering, kindness, and where the word anti-Semitism, the hate of a people born to Jewish faith, comes from. And that it all comes from the heart, so that emotions are not a soft thing to speak about, because we often put academic before emotional intelligence. Anti-Semitism is a form of hate, is a form of emotion that has become rationalized. So I do that. I had the blessing of my mother, who's still alive, to go around, and indeed she's met Derek, and Derek came over for lunch. And indeed, Derek is not a Nazi. But what Derek and I have discovered is that what we ask our audience to do, and is to walk along the metaphorical bridge of tolerance and kindness and acceptance, and not to be prejudiced. We ourselves were prejudiced, of course. He saw me as the Jewess, and at one of our talks in Villars in Switzerland, introduced me as Noemi, the Orthodox Jewess. And it took me a few days, if not weeks, to speak to him, because I didn't want to be emotional when I spoke to him. And also, I wanted to make sure not to hurt him, and to explain that I'm Noemi, who happens to be Jewish, like he's Derek, who happens to be Christian. You don't call any other race like we are called the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim. And I saw Derek as the Nazi, when he's not the Nazi, when he's clearly the grandson of a Nazi. He didn't even know his grandfather. This year's Holocaust Memorial Day Trust theme, I see Olivia over there, was ordinary people. And that's another thing we emphasize, that we are all ordinary. Hitler ain't Superman, nor is Putin, nor is anybody. We're all capable of it. And if we start to accept that, we can educate. So you can see I'm very passionate, and I have to shut up now, because you all know it.
I think you can tell by the reaction of people here how they feel about that. I'm going to ask you a final question, and I think to some extent Hannah's may have already answered it, but what challenges in particular have you faced in sharing your family stories? Anita.
Thank you. The younger generation are so good with technology. On the personal level, the thing I grapple with the most is that I know my mum would hate to be considered a hero. And in telling the story of survival, they become heroes, and that's difficult for me. And it's something I'm always trying to grapple with, and I don't really know how to resolve. I think it's possibly the same for others. The other is, in telling her story, I believe I'm telling it, I know I'm telling it according to how she told it to me, because I then interviewed her many years later, but still, how much of my interpretation am I throwing into the story, and is that right or not? So those are personal things that I grapple with. In terms of generation to generation, well, the challenges are enormous because we're amplifying those amongst all our speakers. I think the first challenge that has been a challenge and still remains a challenge is recognition. And so my question earlier, why are you not talking about second generation? I think it's a narrative that is still not being talked about enough in all the Holocaust education organizations. And it's certainly something that G2G has had to struggle with over the years. But I believe that we are getting recognition now, and people are starting to understand that we do have a role to play. We're not suggesting that descendants of survivors should compete with other forms of testimony. What we're suggesting is use us somehow. We can complement, we can make that bridge between the past and the future. And then in the day-to-day of G2G, well, the challenges are enormous. Securing bookings, getting teachers not to treat us and to treat the Holocaust as a tick box exercise. Now, many of the teachers are wonderful and try really hard, and I know what it's like to be a teacher. You struggle with time, you're given one slot to teach the Holocaust, so it's either them talking or inviting a speaker, but still, it's a challenge to get them to help students prepare for a talk and reflect afterwards. And despite the fact that we have wonderful resources, from Jamie, who's helped us put together resources to help children and teachers, there isn't enough time in the curriculum. And then I suppose the final area is the challenging questions that we might get, and particularly the issue of Israel. It doesn't come up very often, but if it does, how do we deal with it? It's difficult. It's difficult. We try not to let that overtake the conversation. But then, for those of us that believe very strongly in the importance of Israel, are we doing Israel a disservice? I don't know. But those are important challenges. And the other challenges that, and I'll finish on that, is making sure that we do balance the personal, which we've all agreed here in these 2 days is so important, with the history, and making sure that the balance is there and that we get that balance right. So there's a lot of challenges, and I've kind of thrown them out because maybe you guys have got some answers.
Okay, thanks very much, Anita. Hannah?
I think I faced exactly the same challenges, although I'd have to say I probably get asked about Israel 9 times out of 10. And there are various different ways, depending on the children, that it kind of, and the age of the pupils, that it gets handled. And again, I'm like, well, do I need to do more about this? But I think my biggest challenge is I go into a school and I am third generation, I am Jewish. Am I there to discuss anti-Semitism? Am I there to liken what's going on now to different refugees? Am I there to talk about Israel? Like, how many different hats can I wear at one time? Because inevitably I'm there talking about it, and they're like, well, this is when everything first happened in Ukraine. Oh, well, this is going on in Ukraine. They're refugees. Well, yes, they are, but it's different. But they're still refugees. But yes, they are, but it's different. And then Israel can come up, and then, I discuss a little bit at the end about modern anti-Semitism and how it is different to the Holocaust, because I think a lot of the time we've been talking about it and how, it shouldn't happen again and never happen again, but actually modern anti-Semitism is so completely different in so many different ways to what happened during the Holocaust. And that we're not looking at, we're looking at social media and things like that are going on. One of the schools I went to speak at, what's his name, some rapper in America, had just tweeted Kanye West literally the day before. And actually it was a gift for me because it gave me something to talk about, actually, that every single person in the room already knew about. And that was great. But actually I can't stand there for an hour and talk about everything all at once. And I think for me, that's really, really difficult, because I do want to be there sometimes as the only Jew in the village, that they may never have seen a Jewish person before, but I want to give my grandpa's story the time that it deserves. And I do also want to address modern anti-Semitism or Israel if it comes up, and actually there's just not the time to do it. And I think that, we've just done this art project. We were in the school for a whole day, which was incredible, but the whole day still wasn't enough, and they still had questions afterwards. So I think for me, a lot of it is about streamlining or producing packs. Also for parents, I think, for after the fact, after you've been to the class, well, what can the parents then talk about? Because it's great talking about the kids, but if the parents are going home and being fed awful, awful things that they might be fed, actually, you've not really done anything, because you've only been there for an hour, and then they're getting told different things at home. So, there are schools that I'm in contact with now that I'm saying, actually, let's get the parents in and let me speak to the parents before I speak to the children. And then it's almost a way of getting them to understand. So it almost becomes like a family project. So yeah, time is really an issue. And can I just say on the funding before, AJR have been really, really helpful and really, really generous. So thank you very much. It was nothing against that.
That £5 definitely worked, didn't it? Yeah. Okay. Naomi.
I think Anita and Hannah made very valuable points, and I've experienced similar, interestingly enough, in Derby, anti-Semitism by Muslim children or anti-Israel, but one in particular who I made eye contact with, a year 9 student, very pretty, dressed in a hijab, and I actually thought, and I think I'm quite intuitive, that I made friends with her. It was actually the opposite. She giggled throughout the talk. She talked to her neighbor, her neighbor's neighbor, the other side. And it was very powerful when Derek, rather than me, went up to the deputy head and said this girl had been, he used the word, anti-Semitic. We do face challenges. I think Hannah made a very valid point, and I would ask all of you here in the audience and all of those who were here in the 2 days that we're here is that we still have to improve Holocaust education, i.e. the syllabus. And my dream is to see something that they call in education layering, where we're brave enough, we have very good bodies here, that we start in primary schools. And I do already go to a primary school with my mother's story. I was given permission by a child psychologist, or given the courage, because I thought I might damage children. And ultimately, when you peel the Holocaust right back, in Yiddish we say it's being a mensch. We talk about basic human values, and that's the beginning. And it's also where it ends. And that's all our similarities, because we are all the same in that respect. And so it's really important to start, because like Hannah said, we can't do it in an hour, or I have 20 minutes. But I think what our role is as second generation, even more than the history, is to excite people. That might be the wrong word, but to give them a penchant to say, I'm going to look a little bit more, and ask the schools to support us before and after, throughout education, throughout their education. And anti-Semitism is on the line with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was, I hate to use the term, the final solution of it, of that hate, what can happen. The challenge for me personally is, how can I carry it forward, like with all of you, and what can I do? So Caleb might just put something up. I've brought out transliteral animations. I have pestered most of the people in the room to say, help me to bring the stories out, increase my audience. I've got Bernie and Charlotte over here who've taken, Charlotte, capable with Dr. Nick, who's taken my mum's story on and taking that to schools, and schools can respond with whichever way they want. I think we all have to be really creative and use it. And my next project is to make the animations a lot brighter, a lot lighter, because like somebody said earlier on in the day, it happened in daylight. And hey folks, we all belong to one race, and that's the human race. So let's show them.
Wow.
In a few hours, they will send us to the Grunheide labor camp. A couple of hours from now will be the last time I will see my little sister, Naomi. This is the dawn of the long night. The war between National Socialist Germany and Poland took us by surprise. In spite of the boastful speeches of the Polish military leaders, it became clear that the Polish army was unable to resist the German invasion. Jewish
90 seconds left. I'm getting kind of very harsh looks from Bayer and Michael and Susan and others. And so I'm sorry, like the other sessions, it's going to be very difficult to kind of ask for questions. But maybe I could just take a few seconds to share with you a few reflections for myself and wrap up. Firstly, I'd just like to thank, and I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking the panelists who've done a fantastic job. You know, it's been mentioned over these last 2 days, the importance. We're at a critical kind of phase in terms of so long, for so many years, we've been relying on testimony and our first generation. And gradually, as was being discussed before, the baton or the mantle is being handed over to the second and third generations. And so this is a key period in order to have that confidence, to recognize the importance of the next generations, to keep those stories and to keep those memories and to keep those experience of their families alive. And I think all of us in this room, has been mentioned, have a key role to play there. You know, I'd just like to, really on behalf of the AJR, we're very much kind of shifting our focus as well. Of course, the priority will always be the social and welfare of the first generation, but now we also need to plan the role of the AJR for the next generations. And this is a key period. I know many of you will be involved and would love you to be involved as we move ahead. Thank you very much.